Have you ever wondered how ancient people figured out who the father of a child was? I mean, think about it. Today we have DNA tests, paternity courts, and the ability to prove biological relationships with near perfect accuracy. But thousands of years ago, without any of that technology, how did ancient humans even begin to solve this problem? Was it just guesswork? Did they rely on physical resemblance? Or did they have some surprisingly sophisticated methods we wouldn't expect? The truth is, ancient humans were way more clever than we give them credit for. And the methods they developed to determine paternity weren't just random assumptions, they were based on observation, logic, and sometimes even primitive biological understanding. Today we're going to explore one of the most fascinating questions in human history. How did ancient societies figure out who the father was? Let's start with the most obvious answer: physical resemblance. You've probably noticed that children often look like their parents. They might have the same nose, the same eye color, or the same annoying tendency to fall asleep during important meetings. Ancient people weren't stupid. They could see these similarities too. So one of the earliest methods for determining paternity was probably just looking at the kid and saying, "Yeah, that child has your ears. Congratulations, you're the father." But here's where it gets interesting. Physical resemblance isn't always reliable. Sometimes kids look nothing like their biological parents. Sometimes they look exactly like a completely unrelated person who happens to be hanging around. Ancient societies understood this. They weren't basing their entire system of paternity on eyeballs alone. There had to be more. Which brings us to the concept of marriage and legitimacy. In many ancient cultures, paternity wasn't actually about biology at all. It was about law. In ancient Rome, for example, a child born to a married woman was legally considered the child of her husband, regardless of who the biological father might have been. It didn't matter if the husband had been away for 2 years. It didn't matter if everyone in the city knew the woman had been seeing another man. The law said the child belonged to the husband, and that was that. Why would they do this? Because they had a fundamental problem to solve. They needed to know who was responsible for raising a child. They needed to know who owned property and who would inherit it. They needed social order. The biological truth was less important than the legal answer. This is why marriage existed in the first place. It was a legal contract that said, okay, this woman and this man are together, and any children born during this arrangement belong to the man. But societies needed a way to enforce this system. They needed to make sure that women weren't cheating and producing children with unclear paternity. Because if everyone started having children outside of marriage with unclear fathers, the entire social system would collapse. Nobody would know who was supposed to inherit the family farm. Nobody would know who was responsible for raising the kid. It would be chaos. So many ancient societies developed some pretty strict rules about women's sexuality and fidelity. In ancient Mesopotamia, women could be severely punished for infidelity. In ancient Rome, a woman could be divorced and lose her children if she was suspected of cheating. These weren't just moral rules. They were practical systems designed to make paternity as clear as possible. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but how did they actually know if a woman was faithful? Did they just hope for the best? And that's where things get really interesting, because ancient societies didn't just rely on hope. They had methods. One surprisingly common method was midwives. Midwives were present at births, and they had a unique perspective on childbearing. They could observe things about a pregnancy that other people couldn't. They could see how long a woman was pregnant. They could estimate the baby's age based on its size and development. They could notice if something seemed off. If a woman claimed she was 9 months pregnant but gave birth to a tiny premature baby after her husband had been gone for 6 months, the midwife would know something was wrong. This kind of information was incredibly valuable in ancient societies. In fact, midwives were often called upon to give testimony in cases of disputed paternity. Their observations could be the difference between a man being held responsible for a child or not. A midwife could say, "No, this baby is too big to have been born prematurely. Your husband has been gone for 8 months. This isn't his child." And that testimony would carry real weight in ancient legal systems. Another method was simply observation over time. Ancient societies were smaller and more tight-knit than modern ones. Everyone knew everyone else's business. If a woman was seeing a man who wasn't her husband, people would notice. If she became pregnant at a suspicious time, people would notice. If the child looked nothing like the husband but had an uncanny resemblance to the local blacksmith, people would definitely notice. There was no privacy in ancient villages. Everyone was watching everyone else all the time. This might sound intrusive and horrible to us modern people, and it was, but it served a practical purpose. It made it very difficult for a woman to secretly conceive a child with someone other than her husband without at least some people knowing about it. The social pressure alone was often enough to keep women in line, so to speak. Let's talk about another fascinating aspect of ancient paternity systems, the concept of presumed paternity. This is a legal principle that says if a child is born within a certain time frame after a woman's marriage, the child is legally presumed to be the husband's, even if there's no direct evidence. The logic was simple. If a woman gets married and then becomes pregnant, it's more likely that the husband is the father than any random guy on the street. Different ancient societies had different rules about this. Some said any child born within a certain number of months of marriage was presumed to be the husband's. Some said any child born within a certain number of months after the husband's death was presumed to be his, based on the idea that children could be born from pregnancies conceived before the death. These weren't perfect systems, but they worked well enough for the purposes of maintaining social order. In ancient Greece, there's evidence that some city-states required witnesses to be present during the act of marriage consummation. The purpose was partly ceremonial, but it also served as proof that the marriage had been legitimate and that the man and woman had actually been together. If a child was born later and there was any dispute about paternity, they could point to the fact that reliable witnesses had seen the husband and wife consummate the marriage. Now, let's talk about some of the more creative methods ancient societies used. In some ancient cultures, there were actual tests for paternity. Some of these were completely nonsensical. For example, in medieval Europe, there was a test where they would try to feed the alleged father and the child at the same time. If they both ate food in the same order or in the same manner, this was considered evidence that they were related. Obviously, this is completely ridiculous from a scientific perspective, but it shows that people were at least thinking about the problem and trying to find solutions. In other cases, ancient societies relied on something closer to proto-scientific observation. For example, some ancient physicians noticed that certain physical traits seemed to run in families. They noticed that if both a mother and father had curly hair, their children were more likely to have curly hair. If both parents were short, their children were more likely to be short. This was actually a correct observation, even if they didn't understand the mechanism of inheritance. Based on this kind of thinking, they could make educated guesses about whether a child was likely to be someone's biological offspring based on physical traits. Ancient societies also relied heavily on reputation and honor. In many cultures, a man's word was his bond. If a man claimed that a child was his, that claim carried weight, especially if the man had something to gain by the claim. But if a man denied that a child was his denial also carried weight. A man who denied paternity was essentially claiming that his wife had cheated on him, which was a serious accusation with serious consequences. So men didn't make these denials lightly. This system wasn't perfect. Men could be wrong about their own children. Men could be mistaken about the timeline. Worked well, enough for ancient societies to function and maintain legal and social order. Let's talk about inheritance for a moment, because this is where paternity really mattered. In ancient societies, inheritance was huge. It was the difference between a family remaining wealthy and powerful or falling into poverty. So there were major financial incentives to figure out paternity correctly. Fathers wanted to make sure their property went to their actual biological children, not to some other man's kid. So they had a strong motivation to make sure they knew who their children were. In some ancient societies like Rome, there were actually legal procedures for acknowledging paternity. A man could formally acknowledge a child as his own, which would give that child inheritance rights. Conversely, a man could formally repudiate a child, denying that it was his. These formal procedures created a legal record, which was incredibly important for inheritance disputes. Ancient societies also had ways of dealing with children of uncertain paternity. In some cultures, these children were considered illegitimate. They didn't have full inheritance rights. They might have had a different social status than legitimate children. They might have even been killed or abandoned in extreme cases, which is a grim reminder that ancient paternity systems weren't just about figuring out who the father was. They were also about controlling who got to inherit property and who got to claim family membership. Let's not forget about DNA testing. Wait, I know I said ancient times, but humor me for a second. The reason DNA testing is so revolutionary is that it's objective. It doesn't rely on opinions or observations or legal presumptions. It's literally your genetics. If the DNA matches, the paternity is proven. If it doesn't match, it's disproven. But ancient societies didn't have this. They had to rely on everything else, which means ancient paternity systems were always going to be imperfect. They were based on observation, reputation, legal presumption, and social pressure. They could be wrong. Men could unknowingly raise children who weren't biologically theirs. Women could be falsely accused of infidelity. Children could be denied inheritance that was rightfully theirs based on false paternity claims. But here's the key insight. Ancient societies understood that they had a problem and they developed systems to deal with it. These systems weren't random. They weren't just guessing. They were based on logic and observation and a practical understanding of how to maintain social order. The methods varied wildly between different ancient cultures. Some relied more on legal presumption, some relied more on physical observation. Some relied more on social pressure and reputation, but all of them were trying to solve the same fundamental problem: how do we know who the father is? Now let's dive deeper into some specific historical examples that really showcase how creative ancient societies were when it came to paternity determination. In ancient Egypt, for instance, children born to wives during marriage were automatically considered the legitimate offspring of the husband. This was formalized in marriage contracts, which were actually quite detailed documents. These contracts would outline the expectations of both the husband and wife, including fidelity requirements. Interestingly, Egyptian society was relatively progressive compared to other ancient civilizations. Women had more rights and could actually own property and conduct business in their own names. But even with this relative freedom, the question of paternity was still crucial for inheritance and legitimacy purposes. In ancient India, the concept of paternity was tied closely to ritual and religious law. Hindu texts outlined specific procedures for determining paternity. If there was a dispute, the accused father could undergo certain rituals or ordeals to prove or disprove paternity. While these methods weren't scientifically sound, they at least provided a formal process for handling these disputes. The idea was that the truth would emerge through these rituals, based on divine judgment. It's a fascinating example of how different cultures approached the same problem from different angles. Let's talk about ancient Hebrew and Jewish traditions too. According to Jewish law, a child born to a married woman during marriage was considered the legitimate child of the husband. There were specific rules about presumed paternity, including calculations about how long pregnancies typically lasted. If a child was born within a certain time frame after marriage, the presumption of paternity was strong. This legal framework was incredibly detailed and shows how seriously ancient societies took the question of paternity. In ancient China, paternity was also crucial for family lineage and inheritance. The Chinese developed elaborate genealogical records that tracked family relationships across generations. These records were essential for determining inheritance rights and social status. A child's paternity status could determine whether they had rights within the family structure or whether they would be considered illegitimate. The stakes were incredibly high, which is why these systems were so detailed and so strictly enforced. What's fascinating about all these ancient systems is that they recognize paternity as a legal and social question, not just a biological one. They understood that you couldn't always know with absolute certainty who the biological father was, so they created legal frameworks that allowed society to function anyway. They made presumptions about paternity based on marriage, timing, and various forms of evidence. These presumptions weren't always correct, but they worked well enough to maintain social order and allow civilizations to function. Think about how clever this really is. Ancient societies faced an impossible problem. How do you definitively prove biological paternity without DNA testing? The answer was to stop trying to prove it with absolute certainty. Instead, they created legal categories and presumptions that allowed them to make practical decisions about inheritance, legitimacy, and family membership. They shifted the burden of proof. Instead of a man having to prove that he was the father, the presumption was that he was the father if he was married to the mother at the time of conception. A man who wanted to deny paternity had to provide evidence or make a formal declaration. This made the system work by shifting the burden and creating default assumptions. Of course, this system had winners and losers. Wealthy men with resources could often challenge paternity claims if they wanted to. Poor men had fewer options. Women, as we mentioned, bore the brunt of these systems through surveillance and restricted freedom. But from a pure systems design perspective, it's impressive how these ancient societies managed to create functional paternity systems in the complete absence of biological testing. And honestly, when you think about it from this perspective, ancient humans were pretty resourceful. They didn't have DNA tests, but they had midwives who could observe pregnancy length and fetal development. They didn't have lawyers and courts, but they had legal systems that created presumptions of paternity. They didn't have modern investigative techniques, but they had tight-knit communities where gossip and reputation carried real weight. They didn't have scientific understanding of genetics, but they made logical observations about how physical traits passed from parents to children. In some ways, the ancient approach to paternity was more sophisticated than we might expect. It wasn't just about biology. It was about law and social order, and the practical realities of raising children and maintaining family property. It was a holistic approach to a complex problem. It involved legal presumptions, social surveillance, witness testimony, and logical inference based on observable facts. Of course, we should also acknowledge that these ancient systems were often deeply unfair, especially to women. Women had much less freedom and much more scrutiny when it came to sexual behavior. The consequences of being accused of infidelity were often severe. The burden of proving paternity often fell on women, not men. So while ancient paternity systems were clever and functional in many ways, they were also deeply gendered in ways that benefited men and limited the freedom and autonomy of women. But from a pure problem-solving perspective, it's absolutely fascinating to see how ancient humans approached this challenge. They didn't have the tools we have today, but they worked with what they had. They observed. They made logical inferences. They created legal systems to formalize paternity. They relied on their communities to enforce the rules. They created written records and formal procedures. They developed theories about how physical traits were inherited, even without understanding the biological mechanisms. And you know what? These systems worked well enough for human civilization to develop and persist for thousands of years. Humans managed to build cities and create property systems and maintain family lineages, all without knowing for certain who the biological father was in every single case. They accepted uncertainty and built systems that worked in the absence of perfect information. That's remarkable. It's a reminder that humans are incredibly adaptable and creative problem solvers. When faced with a challenging question like, how do we know who the father is? We don't just give up. We think about it. We observe. We create rules and systems. We work together to solve the problem, even if our solutions are imperfect. So the next time you get a DNA test and find out who your relatives are, with perfect certainty, remember that ancient humans were doing something similar with much less information. They were making educated guesses based on observation and logic. They were creating legal systems to formalize their knowledge. They were relying on their communities to enforce their rules. And somehow, despite the lack of modern technology, they managed to figure out paternity well enough to build the civilizations that eventually led to us. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. Ancient humans didn't know who the father was with perfect certainty, but they developed clever systems to make pretty educated guesses. And those systems worked well enough to keep human society running for thousands of years. That's pretty impressive, don't you think? But let's dig even deeper into one more fascinating aspect of ancient paternity systems: the role of written documentation. Many ancient societies developed systems for recording paternity claims in writing. In Rome, for example, fathers could formally acknowledge a child in front of witnesses, and this acknowledgement would be recorded. This created a paper trail. It meant that generations later, families could look back at records and know who was legally considered the father of a child. These written records were incredibly important for inheritance disputes that might arise years or even centuries after the child was born. Similarly, in ancient Jewish tradition, there were written marriage contracts called ketubim that outlined the rights and responsibilities of both husband and wife, including expectations around fidelity and the legitimacy of children. These documents served as legal proof of marriage and could be referenced in disputes over paternity. What's really interesting is how these ancient systems evolved over time. As societies became more complex and trade networks expanded, the need for reliable paternity systems became even more critical. A merchant in ancient Rome needed to know who his legitimate heir was so he could pass his business down to the right person. A landowner in ancient Egypt needed to know who had the legal right to inherit his land. These weren't abstract philosophical questions. They had real economic consequences. And this is where we see ancient societies innovating. They couldn't improve their biological knowledge, but they could improve their legal systems. They could create more detailed procedures. They could require more witnesses. They could develop more sophisticated ways of recording paternity claims. They could create penalties for false paternity claims. In essence, they were trying to create systems that were increasingly tamper-proof and increasingly reliable, even without the ability to verify biological paternity. This evolution toward more sophisticated legal systems shows that ancient peoples weren't just accepting uncertainty. They were actively trying to reduce it within the constraints of their technology and knowledge. They were problem solving in real time, adapting their systems as they encountered new challenges and new situations. In many ways, this historical perspective should make us humble about our own modern solutions. We have DNA testing, but even that has limitations and challenges. We have courts and legal systems, but they still make mistakes. We think we have perfect knowledge, but we don't. In 500 years, people might look back at our paternity determination systems and find them as crude as we find the ancient midwives and legal presumptions. The point isn't that ancient systems were perfect. It's that humans throughout history have been trying to solve the same fundamental problem with the best tools they have available.